Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion production. I'm JJ Kimchi. Free will, or the ability to choose between different possible courses of action, has been a hotly debated topic for centuries. Do human beings in fact possess the ability to freely choose their own actions? Are such choices limited or even determined by external circumstances such as the laws of physics, the processes of history, or the biology of the brain? And is human free will compatible with God's own power and knowledge? Such questions remain a hot topic today among theologians, philosophers, and scientists across the world. Today we'll be exploring how certain great Jewish minds of the past have discussed and analyzed these questions, and the wide array of arguments that have been put forward in this field of inquiry. Joining us to discuss this topic is Dr. Aaron Segal, who is a professor of Jewish philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Segal has written widely in the fields of metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and Jewish philosophy, and was a co-editor of the book Jewish Philosophy in an Analytical Age, a wonderful collection of essays on Jewish subjects from an analytical perspective, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. It is a pleasure to welcome Professor Segal to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So let's dive in to this topic, which is a wonderful topic. And one of the reasons it's a wonderful topic is because it remains a live issue of discussion, both within circles of religious thinkers, but also in philosophy more generally. There are numerous positions on this topic within the field of general philosophy, and philosophers today still stake out positions along this continuum. So could you give us perhaps a little bit of a more a general outline of what are the possible positions on free will, what are the labels attached to them, and can you just sort of sketch briefly what they are and their strengths and weaknesses?
Sure. That's a tall order. It's a vast terrain.
Yes, I do apologize.
It's okay. It's a vast terrain of views. It's probably easiest to get into the topic by looking at sort of a puzzle, the philosophical puzzle, which, unlike some other philosophical topics, is sort of right beneath the surface. So the puzzle that generates this wide range of views is that there's a tension between some very deeply held beliefs that we have about ourselves and feelings and attitudes that we have about ourselves on the one hand, and what we have seemed to learn about ourselves through science, maybe through theology, sort of generally from the outside, so to speak. So on the one hand, we often view ourselves as facing a choice between different paths, between options. These could be, rather trivial deliberations, whether to have chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream, or they could be much more serious things like, what career to pursue. But we, find ourselves all the time facing options. And at least from the inside, it certainly feels like we can go either way, or maybe more than two ways even, but at least more than one way. And it's not just that we feel that way. It seems like the very fact that we're deliberating, considering which option to take, betrays our conviction that we in fact have both of these ways of going, and it's our decision. It's us. We are the ones who are going to determine which way we go. So that's from the inside. And on top of that, we have a bunch of other deeply held convictions and practices, like, holding people morally responsible, whether for good or ill, thinking when people do something, at least sometimes redounds to their credit. If they made the right decision, the decision that was the moral choice, that reflects on them, and they're praiseworthy for doing that. And sometimes we think people are blameworthy for doing bad things, which seems, again, to presuppose that people are free, at least sometimes, to choose. Okay, if they're not free, if you couldn't have done other than what you in fact did, it seems like, well, how can we say you ought to have done otherwise, right? You couldn't have done otherwise. And there's this old saw, ought implies can. So, if you ought to have done otherwise, it means it seems like you could have done otherwise. So that's, and goes together with how we punish people. Our criminal justice system seems to presuppose that people are in fact responsible for what they do. To some extent, maybe our economic system presupposes that. So that's all on one side of the ledger. On the other side, the threat here can emerge from a variety of quarters and at several different levels. So if we're thinking of science, science sort of speaks at various levels of generality. The most general and maybe most fundamental of sciences is physics. And for a while, it seemed like physics told us that everything that happens is an inexorable consequence of the laws of nature and the way things are at any given moment, which includes times very far in the past. So, what happens involving every single molecule right now, including the molecules in your body, would, if that were true, be an inevitable consequence of the way things were billions of years ago, together with these physical laws. But I mean, you don't have to go that far down the road. When we, have learned, and we probably always knew, that we are products of our environment. We now know that there are these things called genes, and we know a lot about the human brain. These are things you alluded to in terms of the influence they have on us and how they shape our decisions. And it seems like they might have such a pervasive influence that it doesn't really leave room for more than one path. So maybe it seems to us like we have more than one path to choose. But if really determinism is true, which I've just sketched a few kinds of determinism, whether it's physical determinism or biological determinism, are basically says that the way the world is at any given point, together with what physical laws, biological laws, whatever the case may be, just dictates how the future will be. And so, if we rolled back the world, so to speak, to a million years ago and had started again, it seems like you'd end up at the very same place and making the very same decisions. So that's on the other side of the ledger. And of course, when you introduce theological considerations, things get even trickier. God, according to many traditions, knew long ago what I would choose. God maybe even decided various things, willed various things that entailed that I would do what I in fact do. And so these branches, even though it seems to me like there are branches or forks in the road, maybe there's really only one fork in the road. So that's the tension. That's the puzzle, so to speak. And the various views out there are ways to contend with that tension, with these puzzles. So the first choice point, the first question is there really a genuine tension here? Can you maybe have both determinism, hold on to a strict determinism where, let's say the past together with the laws dictates a single future on the one hand, and still hold on to free will, right, to our ability to shape our own destiny? That's a question about the compatibility of these two views, determinism and the view that we have free will. And so the two answers to that, either yes or no, go by the names compatibilism and incompatibilism. The view that says that these are compatible, naturally enough, is called compatibilism. The view that says that they're incompatible, naturally enough, is called incompatibilism. And they're, because there are different determinisms, there are different kinds of compatibilisms and different incompatibilisms, but let's just speak about them in general. So compatibilism allows you, if it's true, would allow you to hold on to both determinism and freedom. It doesn't force you to, right? I mean, it's compatible. I don't know, flying saucers are compatible with unicorns. You could have both, but in fact, we have neither. So compatibilism doesn't require that there be freedom, doesn't even require that there be determinism. It just says these can live side by side or together. So that's the first choice point. If you're compatibilist, your life is, in a sense, easier. You don't have to go to the next question, which is what to do, because you just think, okay, maybe we could have both. Obviously, we'll have to talk about how that could be possible. Maybe your life is harder in many ways because you have to explain how could that possibly be. But the incompatibilist, the one who says, no, I think this is probably what most people assume pre-theoretically, that is, before thinking about this in a philosophical way and being exposed to philosophical discussion, I think most people are incompatibilists by natural disposition. The question is, okay, well, then what should we do? And basically, then there's two options. If you're an incompatibilist, you can't have it both ways. You can't have freedom and determinism. So the two answers now to the question of, well, which should we hold on to? Should we hold on to determinism or should we hold on to freedom? Those go by the names hard determinism. Hard determinism means you're an incompatibilist. You think they can't live together, and you're gonna take determinism on board, which means you're gonna have to give up on freedom. People are just not free. None of us is free, even though we may have this deeply held conviction, and it seems to us all the time like we are, but we're really not. And on the other hand, the second view is called libertarianism, not in the political sense, but in the metaphysical sense. And libertarians think that, yeah, these are incompatible, but determinism is false. Okay, it's just not true that everything that happens is an inevitable consequence of some set of laws and the state of the world at a given time. Now, it's worth noting that there are a bunch of different levels of compatibilism, like watered down and full blooded, and I think it's important to put that on the table. So one thing you might that you might hold if you're a compatibilist is, you think, yeah, I mean freedom in exactly the same way that the rest of my philosophical friends do. I think I really can choose more than one option at any given time, or at least sometimes I have that ability to go in different ways. And I'm not going to water that down. I'm not going to give you any strange, newfangled philosophical analysis of that. I mean it exactly the same way you do. And yet, I think that's compatible with determinism. Right? That sounds maybe shocking, maybe actually just incoherent. But some philosophers have attempted to go that route. And I think that's really the interesting kind of compatibilism, the full-blooded one, the one who's not going to water things down. It may turn on, whether this can be pulled off, might turn on the nature of laws, for example. So if you think laws of nature are just basically summaries of the things that happen, well, that includes the things that we do. And so maybe we actually have power over the laws of nature. This sounds maybe like a very religious view. It sounds like all people could just perform miracles. As it happens, the philosophers who defend this are actually atheists. At any rate, that's a way of going, which, as I said, I like that. I'm attracted to it because it's bold. It's willing to say, yeah, I mean it the same way everyone else means it when I talk about freedom. But the more standard garden variety compatibilist will, to some extent, reconceptualize freedom or reconceptualize the ability to do various things. Right? So nowadays, you have a bunch of contenders for the compatibilist view, but let's say one of them says, it has to be that your desires are what lead to what you choose. That's one thing, and pretty much everyone's going to think that. Can't be that it's imposed from without. But in addition, that your desires, what you want to do, is in line with what you want to do. So an addict, or maybe that's not the best example, but someone who has just a desire, a one-off desire that doesn't really fit with who they are deep down, with what Harry Frankfurt called their second-order desires. That's just a fancy way of talking about what you want to want. If that's the case, then you're not really free when you do it. But as long as there's that alignment, right, then even if there's no other choice that you had, you're still free, and you could even be held responsible for the things that you do. Okay, so that's sort of a lay of the land, and there's a lot more to say.
There is a lot more to say, and I want to firstly thank you and congratulate you for giving us basically a semester's worth of philosophy lectures in about 10, 12 minutes. That was mightily impressive. So that is an outlining, as you say, of the basic positions: libertarian, determinist, compatibilist, etc. What, of course, is interesting is that some of these positions are shared by different thinkers across the political spectrum. So, to give the example of determinism, you can find determinists among, let's say, the more hardcore scientific naturalists or atheists of our age. But you can equally find determinists among some of the most pious theologians, such as Luther, such as Calvin, from centuries gone by. And therefore, where these positions sit on the religious spectrum is not necessarily uniform and can take different forms in different places, which is of course fascinating. So now that we have the basic lay of the land, let us dive in a little bit into the sort of intellectual history of the Jewish approach. And I think what we're going to start with is actually the libertarian position. Otherwise, the position, as you mentioned, that there is such a thing as free will as is popularly imagined. We have perfect ability to choose it, unconstrained, or at least without very large constraints from external forces. And of course, the major champion of that in the Jewish tradition is the Rambam in Maimonides. So could you perhaps describe firstly his general position, how he backs it up, and as well the arguments he proposes for it, and also why is it important to him and to others who hold this position that there is absolute, unconstrained, total free will for all human beings?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a fantastic question. The terminology is a bit tricky here, and the substance is also a bit tricky here. So saying that Maimonides Rambam is a libertarian is something that, I mean, given what you mean by that, I actually agree with. Given what I mean by libertarian, I'm not sure I agree with that. So I'll explain why in a second. But setting terminology aside, like you said, right, that the ability to really go in more than one way seems pretty clearly to be Rambam's view as he lays out black on white in his laws of repentance. He uses a phrase drawn from the Mishnah, the position of Rabbi Akiva, famously said "Hakol tzafoy v'arashut nituna," which, at least as Maimonides understood it, meant everything is foreseen by God, but free will is still given. The Rambam Maimonides adopts that phrase in his Laws of Repentance, and he starts out by saying "Rishut nituna l'chol adam." Right, the choice is given to every person, and he goes to a pretty far extreme in his formulation of just how unbridled this capability is. He says everyone is capable of being as righteous as Moses, or as villainous, as evil as Yeravam. Right, so we could really every individual could really go either way. Presumably doesn't mean at any given moment. He means over the course of a lifetime, a series of choices could get you there. Now, like I said, I agree with you that Maimonides held that view, but right, as is often the case with Rambam, right, the minute you attribute to him what he seems to say, you get lots of Maimonides scholars upset or up in arms. In this case, I actually agree with the scholars that things are slightly more complicated than they might initially appear. Okay, but not exactly as they see it. So there are some scholars who argue that Maimonides' real view, the one in his guide, which is by these scholars' lights always his real view, is the view that denies free will entirely. So this is based on a passage at the end of the second book of his guide, and they read that to mean that Maimonides endorsed a thoroughgoing determinism. Maimonides talks about proximal causes and how God is really the ultimate cause of everything that happens. And so they take Maimonides to be endorsing a thoroughgoing determinism of absolutely everything, including human choices. And so some of these scholars say, therefore, Maimonides denied free will. Right? They seem to be ignoring the compatibilist possibility. Others say, no, actually, Maimonides was a compatibilist. That's the lesson that they draw. But what they do deny is what Maimonides seems to say in his Laws of Repentance, that you can very often choose among different alternatives. So you, in fact, do have alternative possibilities open. They say, no, because he's a compatibilist, that's not really true, right? And that just seems to ignore the possibility that we mentioned, sort of the bold compatibilist position that says, no, even this robust two-way kind of freedom to choose between alternatives is in fact compatible with determinism. So, I mean, my own view, for what it's worth, is that Maimonides actually did endorse determinism. I don't think it's clear in that chapter in the guide, but I do think, based on other things he says, we have very good reason to think that theological determinism is true. That is, God's will or God's nature suffices for the truth of absolutely everything, okay, leaving no room for any sort of indeterminism. He also, even in his more exoteric and pretty straightforward writings, makes clear that he recognizes the importance of character. As following Aristotle, that your character very often limits your options. Certain kinds of people we just can't. Not only could not imagine them doing certain things, we think they're just not really possible for those particular people to do. Right? I mean, like, imagine the Chafetz Chaim, for example, just, I don't know, walking into a room and stabbing someone to death for no apparent reason, or no reason at all. Like, this is not something, sorry for that gruesome image, but this doesn't seem
A rather disturbing one, but yes.
disturbing, yes, right? And it seems inconceivable, and may actually be just not something that the Chafetz Chaim could have done, given his character. And Maimonides definitely recognizes that, and in some places recognizes, it seems, that some people are just limited from birth in terms of what their character is and how much it can be shaped. Right. So we might have to moderate to some extent what he says in Laws of Repentance. But at the end of the day, I think Maimonides was a bold compatibilist. So he held we really do sometimes have the ability to do more than one option. We can pursue, more than one option. Obviously, not both of them, but we can choose between the two. That being consistent with somehow the fact that there is this thoroughgoing theological determinism. And he doesn't tell us how those can be reconciled, but I do think he holds both of those things. Now, what he does tell us is why he thinks it must be the case that we have free will, and why he thinks even that we must have this two-way kind of free will where we can in fact choose between alternatives. And he gives us in that passage in the Laws of Repentance, he gives us at least three justifications, three kinds of arguments. One is what you might call the L'chaim argument. I call it that because it's really a series of proof texts, right? Scriptural proof texts. The most famous of which is the verse that says, I place before you today life and death, choose life. That, Maimonides says, shows that we must have real, genuine choice, right? That God is placing before us, more than one option, and it's up to us which option we're going to choose. He has a series of scriptural proof texts, but he also has two more philosophical arguments that, they're still based on religious premises, but they're arguments, not just citations of texts. So one argument is that otherwise it would be a compromise of divine justice. Right? If we weren't really free, and free in the sense that Maimonides is talking about, he thinks God would not be would not be justified in meting out rewards and punishments, which is, a fundamental tenet of scriptural religion, and Maimonides makes it one of his principles of faith. Right. So, and he thinks that's incompatible with a picture on which, we don't have freedom to choose. If, like I said at the outset, if we're not free, presumably we're not responsible. If we're not responsible, none of us deserves to be punished, and God would be unjust in doing so. And his final argument is that the entire Torah, all the commandments, would be pointless, would be odious. Right? What would be the point in issuing these commandments, whether with reward and punishment or not? But the entire enterprise of giving commandments would seem to be senseless. It doesn't make any sense because regardless, a person is going to do what they were, so to speak, fated or determined to do. So those are his three arguments, and you can extract from there, reasons why he thinks it's important. What you won't find there is him placing this in the scale or sort of in the same level as what he takes to be, the highest good in human life. Which is intellectual achievement, right? For Maimonides, there's some irony here, actually. For Maimonides, the highest good for a human being is intellectual achievement, not, freely acting, but just coming to know eternal truths and metaphysical truths, theological truths. Where free will ranks in that scale of values, it's not entirely clear, right? How he puts that together. The irony is, I got ahead of myself. The irony is that the most famous expositor of a hard determinist view, the Rambam's arch nemesis, at least on this issue, but on many other issues as well, is Chazdai Kreskas, who we might get to, who denies that we have free will. And for him, intellectualism is actually pretty low down on the totem pole of values. And what is higher up, what's really at the top, is devotion to God through observance of his commandments. Okay, so there's this bizarre irony here where you have the denier of freedom who's placing on the pedestal our human actions. That's sort of that's where the value is, the highest value in human life, and the one who demotes human action at the expense of intellectual achievement, who's insisting that it better be the case that we're free.
So I do want to get the Chasdai Kreskas soon, to get to the determinist part, but I want to stay on this what might be called libertarian part for a moment, even though I must confess I was a tad shocked to hear you defend the position that Maimonides is in fact a determinist, considering how much and how clearly and how emphatically he emphasizes his libertarian position in the Mishnah Torah. But I suppose this is an ongoing argument among Maimonides scholars of how much weight you give to the guide versus how much to the Mishnah Torah. And we had a whole episode, several episodes really, on this sort of topic. So I won't go into that. But if you do take the libertarian position, which of course Maimonides defends, and I would say that the majority of Jewish thinkers who have, let's say, certainly in the pre-modern era, who have broached the subject, do posit free will of some kind. But they then have to parry a couple of objections to this. And those two objections come in the form basically of God's knowledge and of God's power, right? So the problem surrounding libertarian free will is that if human beings have total freedom to choose everything, so then two questions. Number one, does God know what they will choose? And if so, doesn't that gravely compromise? I mean, if God knows that I'm going to do action X, surely I have no choice. So that's one problem, is God's knowledge. And the other one is God's power. Because if we say that God ultimately decides what goes on in the world, well, if I'm the one who makes the decisions and there are actually consequences to the decisions I make, then surely I'm the one who decides, or the people who make these decisions decide, rather than God deciding. So these are, I suppose, the two principal objections leveled at theists who take the position of libertarian free will. So my question, I suppose, is firstly, how does Rambam try and parry these objections? But more generally, what are the kinds of answers that are generally offered by those who seek to defend free will, but who are very aware of these two quite serious challenges, God's knowledge and God's power, to the idea of perfect human free will?
Right. Okay. Also, a huge terrain to cover. I will try to cover it very briefly. Okay. So Rambam at least takes on, in some sense of that term, he takes on the issue of freedom and foreknowledge, of how God could foreknow what we're going to do freely. But he doesn't really give an answer, right? So, I mean, and the Ravid, his most famous opponent, at least in the Mishnah Torah, took him to task for this. He basically says God, first of all, is identical with God's knowledge. Okay, so you have to understand that, which is something that he discusses also in the guide, and he lays it out black on white. One of the bold theological positions that he lays out black on white, even in the Mishnah Torah. And he also points out that we don't really understand God, not just in the sense that most people would say, we don't fully understand God. Maimonides was an apophaticist. He thought we couldn't really speak of God at all. We can't conceptualize God. So the same thing holds for God's knowledge. Okay, so we can't really understand God's knowledge. And in a way, this diffuses the puzzle, right? I mean, the puzzle can only get off the ground if you think you have a firm grasp on the two sides of the puzzle. The fact that we have freedom and that God foreknows this. So if we're going to understand foreknowledge in the standard sense, that God knows this and knows it before we do it, then you have the ingredients, at least, for a genuine puzzle. If you think that you don't even have a grasp, you don't have a grip on the second piece there, right, divine knowledge, then it's hard to formulate the puzzle to begin with. Okay, so some people might think it's a cop-out. It certainly doesn't seem to be customized, just to solve this problem. It's not as though Rambam endorsed these views about God and about the identity between God and God's knowledge just to avoid the problem of freedom and foreknowledge. It certainly doesn't seem that way. So you can't fault him for that, but it doesn't really illuminate all that much. In the Jewish philosophical tradition more broadly, you do have a number of other positions. So the most radical, in a way, it's also a family of positions, is to in some way or other curtail God's foreknowledge. So not to say, like Maimonides, that says that we don't really understand it, but we affirm it. No, they say we can affirm it, but only partially. Okay, so God knows lots of things on this view. This is a view that you find at least one version of in Gersonides and another version of this in Ibn Daud. So what they both share, at least, is that while God has perfect knowledge of the past and perfect knowledge of the present, and also perfect knowledge of those future events that are already settled, right? The events that are not up to human free will, they're not otherwise undetermined. So God has perfect knowledge of those. But what God doesn't know now, right, is what you're going to freely do tomorrow. He doesn't know what anyone is going to freely do in the future. For Ibn Daud, this seems to be a matter of there just being no truth in the matter about what's going to be in the future. If we're talking about undetermined choices, right, there's just no fact right now as to what's going to be. So there's nothing for God to know. That's how he seems to understand it. Gersonides, on the other hand, it's not entirely clear, to me at least. It's a thicket that you have to make your way through in his book on this topic. But from what I've been able to understand, he seems to think that there perhaps are these truths, but that in any case, God's knowledge is rather constrained or limited, so that God just doesn't know what is going to be, whether or not it's true that at the present moment that you're going to do X, Y, Z freely tomorrow. Right? And we find these positions actually in contemporary philosophy of religion and discussions of freedom and foreknowledge. This is what's known as open theism. This family says that God is sort of open to an open future. So maybe the future itself is open, right? That's God is open to an open future. In other words, there's nothing that's settled yet. Or even if there is, God can't possibly know. No one could possibly know what free future actions will be. And therefore, the fact that God doesn't know them, even though they are in fact truths, is no real limitation on God. It's like the same way that God can't create a square circle, right? That's just not something that's possible. It's not possible to create around a square circle. And so this is just like that. So you have a camp nowadays among philosophers of religion who, in discussing this issue, endorse open theism, and you have these precedents in Jewish philosophy. I think that's a rather minority position in Jewish philosophy. I don't think most Jewish philosophers or theologians would go for that. So if you're not going to do that, another rather standard position, even nowadays, is what's called the dependence solution. Okay, this is, again, just to address the question of how God could know something in advance, right? And then you're still free to do that or an alternative, right? So it seems like you could act in such a way that if you were to act that way, then either God would have had a different belief, or what God believed would be false. That's the puzzle. And the dependence solution says that this isn't really a problem. You do, in fact, have that ability, right, to act in such a way that if you would act that way, God would believe something differently. And that's because God's beliefs about the future depend on the future rather than vice versa. Right? This is I think, a standard answer that you even find nowadays outside of philosophical circles. It's still defended in philosophical circles, and it was defended in one form or another by Segal, by Halevi, and by others. Now, that's all just to address that what I would think of as sort of a fun but not really deep problem. Okay, the deep problem comes in the second half of your question when we're talking about God's power, God's will, and God's providential control.
That's vastly more consequential.
Yes, exactly. Vastly more consequential. And importantly, basically nothing we've said until now to address the problem of freedom and foreknowledge does anything to address that problem. So you might think, oh, well, at least the second solution, which allows God to have perfect foreknowledge, not like Gersonides and Ibn Daud, right? He has foreknowledge, so why can't God use it? The problem is that it's too late. It comes to God too late in the explanatory sequence, right? So God can't be using the knowledge that's derived or dependent on the free actions of creatures to decide, let's say, whether to put that creature, whether to put that human being in a certain situation. Because I don't mean that it's temporally posterior to, that it comes later in time, but I mean it's explanatorily posterior to. Right? God basically has to decide at the outset, oh, I'm going to put this guy in this situation and let's see what happens. Right? And lo and behold, maybe God will know this right at the outset as soon as he made this decision, but it's too late at that point to do anything about it. Right? So this kind of foreknowledge seems to be basically providentially useless. And so that's a real difficulty. How do you reconcile providence with free will? And a lot of ink has been spilled on that. I'll just mention one view that you find in the general philosophical tradition. It goes back to the work of the Jesuit philosopher Louis de Molina. So it's known as Molinism. Molina said that the solution to this problem is that in addition, perhaps, to knowing what will be the case, even before that, in sort of the stages of the divine, the unfolding of the creation. So God starts with knowledge of how things have to be and what things are possible and impossible. And then God also knows all the facts about how any given creature God would choose to create would freely act in any circumstance in which they'd find themselves. Right? This seems to be like these very metaphysical facts that don't sit on anything. So some people don't think there could be any such facts. But he thinks, yeah, there could be such facts, and God knows all of them. And then God decides, based on that knowledge, which circumstances to actualize so that people, will make the decisions that God wants them to make, all in accordance with a divine plan. And so this seems to allow you to have perfect providence, if you want that. God could really be orchestrating everything down to the last detail, at the same time as holding on to libertarian free will. Like in the most robust sense, these creatures, they're not determined to do what they're doing by anything, even by God. Right? This is just a brute fact about them, that this is what they would do if they were put in these circumstances. Now, whether there's any Jewish precedent for that, probably not anything significant. There's an article by another philosopher in Israel, Beryl Dov Lerner, where he ingeniously tries to find some precedent for Molinism. I think probably the strongest precedent might be the law, or what the Mishnah says famously about the rebellious son, the Ben Sorer Umoreh, where it says that he's nidon al shem sofo, like that the reason he is killed is not because of what he has done, but because of his sof. Now, you might translate it as what he will do, but he won't do that because we're going to kill him before he does it. So it must mean he's killed for what he would do, right? For what he would have done if we had let him live. That all by itself doesn't give you Molinism unless you think that he must have been doing that freely. And here things can get pretty complicated when you're looking at the Talmudic sugyot. I think there might be some evidence that they really did think of this as genuine punishment, despite the fact that we're talking about what he would have done. So you put all that together, you might find some Molinism there. But again, that's really just casting about for precedent where there isn't any really strong precedent.
To be honest, to my mind, one of the most shocking ways of dealing with this is actually the one proposed by Maimonides himself, who, in that chapter in Hilchot Tshuva, in the Mishnah Torah and his Laws of Repentance, where he says that what we mean when we say that God wanted something to happen is that God wanted us to have free will, and therefore if we do something, we can call that God's will, because ultimately he willed us to have free will, and therefore willed us to have the ability to do the thing. That seems to be what he's saying, which is a wild rereading of what God's will is, because then ultimately God's will is up to the person who's acting, which I thought was a rather astonishing way of squaring this particular circle. I don't know if you agree.
Right, that is rather astonishing. It's not clear whether you can really say that and still hold on to anything like a traditional view about providence. And if that's not really a criticism, a new criticism of Maimonides, that's sort of baked in to his view about God's will in general. So yeah, that's true. That's quite astonishing. It in some ways reminiscent of what I mentioned about the bold compatibilist view that says the laws of nature are under our control, right? Because laws of nature are nothing but the sum total of whatever happens, including whatever we do. So in some ways, this makes God's will parallel to laws of nature in that regard.
Okay, so having, to a certain degree, I wouldn't say exhaustively, but at least flown over some of the major topics on the libertarian side, let us move to the opposite side of the spectrum, which is the determinist side. And we mentioned Chastai Kreska, so I suppose we could start with him. But more generally, are there Jewish thinkers who have defended determinism, and I suppose who are they, and how do they defend it? I mean, let's start with that, and then we can go after that into the problems that this poses for the traditional Jewish worldview. But let's start with that. I mean, what is the position of Kreskas and his followers, and how does he defend it?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know if Kreskas had many followers in this regard, even among his fans, so to speak, his philosophical fans. Many of them seem to be critical of him on this front, even his closest students. So yeah, he sort of stands alone, at least in the medieval period, among Jewish philosophers. He endorses a thoroughgoing determinism. It's a thoroughgoing theological determinism, by which I mean that it's God's will or God's nature that suffices for the truth of everything, which is what I attributed before to Maimonides. But here it's crystal clear that Kresgas endorses that. And he clearly, pretty clearly, I'd say, endorses the consequence of that as he sees it, that none of us is free, and that therefore none of us is ever deserving of blame or praise or punishment or reward. His reason for being a determinist is this deep-seated theological conviction, which you were, alluding to before, and it was formalized in a number of ways among Muslim philosophers and other Christian philosophers. That God's very nature or God's will should suffice for absolutely everything, and if not, then it's kind of peculiar theologically that there are these things that just float free of God's will. And so he has this argument that traces back to the Muslim philosopher Avicenna for like I said, an absolutely thoroughgoing determinism, which makes no room for any exceptions. Okay, so it's not like it's true of everything except human beings. Not like it's true for everything except human beings' inner lives. It's just true, period, that there's no exceptions to this determinism. Everything is determined, even a person's internal states. And so Kresgas, what we would say, bites the bullet, and he says, yes, we are not free. Maybe this is not something that should be publicized. He says so, and so maybe this shouldn't be on the podcast, but I'm fine with.
Oh no, we're going to keep this in.
Yeah, we're going to keep this in. Okay, the juicy stuff. Yeah. So he says maybe this shouldn't be the kind of thing that's publicized, but it's really the case that no one is in fact responsible for what they do. I mean, he's well aware of the challenges to this. And so, one challenge, which we mentioned Maimonides already raised, is the challenge from divine justice, right? How could God be just in doling out punishments and rewards if people aren't really responsible for what they do, if they don't deserve any credit or dismerit, right? So his answer to that is punishments and rewards are not really being doled out as punishments and rewards. They're not retributive, right? It's basically a system of carrots and sticks that are meant to incentivize good behavior and to disincentivize bad behavior, right? And I think actually it runs deeper than that. So that sounds, maybe a little superficial. I think actually his view is that the good behavior that the Torah is incentivizing, it is ultimately just the love of God, and the love of God is the ultimate reward. So what God is trying to incentivize here, right, through the use of what seem to be external rewards, aren't really external or extrinsic. They're internal to the life well lived, to doing the right thing. So if you're doing the right thing, that means, you're doing mitzvot joyously, which really is just a matter of, on his view, loving God with all your heart. And that is its own reward. So that is the reward that's promised. And if you're not, then you're not. But it's not like God is responsible for the fact that he's doling out a punishment for someone who isn't, because God isn't doling out any punishment beyond just the fact that you're now failing to achieve this great thing. Now, I said that he leaves no room for any exceptions to that. That is somewhat controversial in scholarly circles among scholars of Kresgas, who are few in number, unfortunately.
Yeah,
there should be more scholars of Kresgas. At any rate, some of Kresgas's great interpreters have actually interpreted him as carving out an exception for our inner life. So they say, no, regarding our identifying with being joyful in the performance of mitzvot, that feeling of joy, that sort of decision to be joyous when performing mitzvot, that is something that we are in fact free to do, and we're free to do it because we're not determined, right? And this just seems to be a misreading. If you put together all the pieces in Kresgas, it seems to me pretty clear that's not the case. He makes no exception whatsoever for his general claim that none of us is responsible for anything we do, even for our inner states and our inner life. But he does talk about the fittingness of reward specifically for the joy that we have, or joyous performance, of the commandments. And that's what led these scholars to interpret them that way. I think what he's actually arguing there is that there's not going to be any reward for performance of mitzvot that isn't joyous. And likewise, there's no punishment for violations and prohibitions where that doesn't involve an identification with it, because what God is trying to incentivize in the first place, what the Torah is trying to incentivize in the first place, its primary aim is the joyous performance of mitzvot. And so there'd be no purpose, there'd be no reason in having these carrots and sticks applicable, even in cases where there's no joy. Anyway, so that's Kresgas's view. You later have in the Hasidic tradition, like I said, I don't think in the medieval Jewish philosophical tradition he really has any counterparts. But once you get maybe a little bit in Kabbalistic circles, I'm not sure. But once you get to certain Hasidic thinkers, certain schools in Hasidic thought, there you do seem to find a position that on the one hand drastically limits human freedom. And it does so in part because it embraces a really, really thorough theological determinism. And on the other hand, does try to make space for the internal life, that the internal life is somehow free. Right? So you find this in the Ishbitzer, Mordechai Yosef Leiner, and his students, children. You find this idea. So in some senses, actually, this goes beyond what Kresgas maintains, because the Hasidic thinkers that say that, these Hasidic thinkers, say that regarding our activities, our behaviors, right, those are actually fated, F-A-T-E-D, right, in the sense that they would happen regardless of what went on. Okay, that's even stronger than being determined, which is a very important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about how Kresgas would respond to Maimonides, right? So, but for them, those things are actually completely fated. But on the other hand, the internal world is up to us, right? So whether we choose to be joyous or whether we, what kind of internal life we have, that on their view is the purview of human freedom.
Which to me sounds, I don't know if bizarre is the right word, but it's certainly counterintuitive, because one thinks that actions are in fact free, but inner states are something we can't really help, right? There's a famous,
right.
There's a literature dealing with this. How can the Torah command, let's say, love or fear of God? Surely these are things that are reflexive and instinctual and
right.
not subject to control. And there are all sorts of answers, ways that you can theoretically try and control inner states. But the presumption, I think, among most people is that one's inner reactions to something are not really subject so much to conscious control, and therefore not really part of the purview of what you can reasonably be expected to control. And therefore that's why the vast majority of the commandments are in fact practical, things that you have to do rather than things that you have to feel. But what you're saying is those who are determinists tend to say that no, in fact, our actions are prescribed and predetermined. There's nothing we can do about that. But the inner states are uniquely under our control, and it is upon that we are judged.
At least for these Hasidic thinkers. Yeah, I mean, regarding the question more broadly of how your inner states could be free, we should distinguish between different kinds of inner states. So you're right that it's normally thought that things like beliefs and even desires, feelings, that these are not under our voluntary control, let alone things that we could freely choose to have or not. But that doesn't exhaust our inner life, right? So decisions that we make when we are deliberating between options and then make a decision, make a choice, that's a mental episode, right? That's a psychological episode, which then has consequences, obviously, for what we do, or at least we hope it has consequences. So if there's any freedom at all in the world, there's got to be freedom in some aspects of our inner life, right? Because if our choices weren't free, then none of the actions we'd be taking would be free either.
Right. Let me ask, I mean, were there Jewish thinkers who can recognizably be called compatibilists? And are those who both affirmed a kind of determinism and a kind of free will and tried to make these two compatible? Is that a recognizable strand within the Jewish intellectual tradition, or not really?
Right. So, you do have explicit compatibilism between freedom and foreknowledge. Right? So, like I said, there are a bunch of different questions, and so a bunch of different incompatibilisms and compatibilisms, because it all depends on the kind of determinism you're talking about. So, if we're talking about the kind of question that arises due to God's foreknowledge, so like we mentioned, right, Halevi, Sadia, and a few others, they're explicitly compatibilists about that. I mean, I guess as is Maimonides in that passage, although what he means by foreknowledge is unclear. Right? But these other thinkers are crystal clear that they mean the same thing we mean, and just they think that there's a solution to this problem. We can have both. You can have free actions even though you have foreknowledge. When you move over to determinism of other kinds, so let's say a theological determinism that derives from the divine will, so God willing that such and such be the case just for everything, and that is somehow supposed to be compatible with our nonetheless choosing things freely. I don't know if you have any explicit defense of such a thing. The closest I can think of, and maybe I'm just forgetting something right now, but the closest I can think of is in Albo, Yosef Albo, actually one of the students of Kreskas, and one of the students who did not agree with him about freedom. So he maintains that we are free, and he has this very interesting account of what happened regarding Pharaoh and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which is a question already raised by Maimonides. Right? How could God harden Pharaoh's heart and then seem to take him to task for what he did after God had hardened his heart, or under God's influence, determining him to decide not to let the Israelites go? Maimonides has his answer. Albo, I think his answer is best understood along the lines of what the contemporary Christian philosopher Eleanor Stump argues is going on in that episode in a compatibilist way. So she says, and I think you can read this in Albo's text, that basically if God had let Pharaoh decide to do what he wanted to do at that moment, then, which is let the people go, then that action would have actually been unfree, because he would have had this whim, this desire that didn't really align with who he was deep down. And so in order to get Pharaoh's actions of deciding not to let the Israelites go to be free, God realigned his first order desires with his higher order desires, the distinction we mentioned before from Harry Frankfurt. So God made it so that now his first order desires will actually reflect who he is, like what he wants to want deep down. And so actually made Pharaoh free, and he otherwise would have been unfree. And so this is, assuming a pretty clearly compatibilist account of what freedom is, one that you find in the contemporary philosophical literature. Like I said, it's not, as clear as Eleanor Stump would put it in Albo, but I think you can find it there. So that, in a way, is a defense of compatibilism.
Interesting. I suppose those who wanted to oppose this might invoke the title of Harry Frankfurt's more famous book.
Yeah, I don't know if
which we shan't disgrace this podcast by naming out loud. So one last sort of little section of the whole free will question within Judaism, which I would like to put on the table, is the way the free will is used in another question within religious philosophy, namely that of theodicy, or of the defending God or defending divine actions, which is that it is often proposed that one of the reasons that God allows bad things to happen is to maintain free will. It's often called the free will defense. That why does he allow bad people to do things to other people? Is because were he to step in and stop bad people from acting, that would compromise human free will, and human free will is something that is worth being preserved, and therefore God doesn't step in to do that. So I have a general question about this, which is, firstly, is this a frequently trotted out defense within the Jewish tradition? And more than that, are there those who see this as insufficient? Because, of course, there is the objection that, okay, it's very nice to preserve human free will, but is that really worth a Holocaust? Is that really worth, massacre and a destruction and, and all sorts of terrible things? Meaning, is there such a value in free will that God is willing to tolerate the most horrendous abuses? So this is, so I suppose a twofold question is this often discussed, and is this occasionally rejected?
Right. Okay. So it is occasionally discussed. It's not often discussed. I think actually, if you're looking for a full development of a free will theodicy in Judaism, Jewish thought, you won't find it until very late. Again, unless something is escaping me, which is entirely possible. But I think you really find it first in Eliezer Berkovitz. I mean, that late, the 20th century Jewish thinker. It doesn't mean there aren't precedents for something like a free will theodicy or defense in the Jewish tradition, but in the Christian tradition, you have it going back quite a ways to Augustine and then many Christian thinkers subsequent to him. In the Jewish tradition, you'll find in rabbinic literature something that could be plausibly identified with what's called a soul-making theodicy. The idea being that evil is necessary, bad things are necessary in order to make human souls or to make creaturely souls, to develop our character, our virtue, our morality, and there's supposed to be some sort of internal connection actually between the suffering that we see in others and even maybe our own suffering that promotes growth, promotes spiritual and moral growth that would in fact be impossible without it. So, in the Jewish tradition, you have things like Yisurin Shel Ahava, tribulations of love, in the rabbinic tradition, which have an affinity with soul-making theodicies. They're not really identical. My teacher and friend David Schatz wrote an excellent survey of theodicies in the Jewish tradition, and he points out a number of very important differences between what you find in the rabbinic tradition about tribulations of love and soul-making theodicies. Probably the most important is that usually soul-making theodicies are trotted out to explain why God permits bad things, not why God inflicts bad things. It's not generally taken to justify that, whereas in the rabbinic tradition, it is. But it's not entirely clear that you need anything like freedom, like free actions, for this to work. Right? That's an internal issue to the soul-making theodicy project, of whether you think that in order for this to be as valuable as it needs to be to justify the evils, that this moral and spiritual growth has to be free. Even if you think it does, it's not really playing the same role. That is, human freedom is not playing the same role it usually plays in a free will theodicy, a free will defense, which sees basically all evil as the product of a creaturely abuse of free will. You have hints maybe later in Ramchal, Rebbe Moses Chaim Luzzatto, the 18th century Jewish philosopher and theologian and Kabbalist. I don't think you actually have anything that really amounts to a free will defense there. So that's as to the first part of the question. As to the second part, sure, right? That's a whole other course. Even just to discuss the free will theodicy and all of its problems, right? One major problem you might raise is that on the one side is the value of free will, which you might think is pretty valuable, but on the other side is a huge amount of evil and terrible things. And you might think that the value of free will is there, but it's just not sufficient to justify all the evil that we have in the world. And there are a host of other objections to the free will theodicy, having to do with like natural evil, things that on the face of it at least don't seem to be the product of any creaturely action at all, earthquakes, hurricanes, and whatnot causing deaths. This doesn't seem to be like we can explain this based on free will. That's just another objection. There are lots of them, and so lots of people who reject the free will theodicy, but that's not to say there aren't answers, right? So this is just the beginning of a conversation about that theodicy, and a lot has been written about it.
Right. The truth is, we're going to have certainly another episode on this, because this is a massive question. I suppose, the last major question I would ask is on recent developments, because over the last few decades, this topic of free will has become a topic of great interest within the philosophical and scientific community, on a broader scale, because of developments, firstly, I suppose, in philosophy, but also in neuroscience, right? That we have better understanding of how the brain works and better imaging and better knowledge of decision-making processes. It's far from perfect, but at least, and there's been a spate of books over the last decade or two on this subject. And I suppose my question is, has Jewish philosophy or Jewish philosophers, have they responded to this in kind? Have there been new avenues of research on the free will question from within a Jewish perspective opened up in the last 10, 20 years? Are there people working on this? What kind of reaction has been engendered from within the Jewish world, if any, to this resurgent interest in the question of free will in philosophy and in science?
Yeah. Again, an excellent question, an invitation for more people and maybe your listeners to engage in this kind of thing, because unfortunately it hasn't elicited the kind of work that it should have. Some of the stuff, I should say, some of the putatively relevant scientific discoveries, I think at the end of the day are not really relevant at all. So the experiments in neuroscience, particular experiments that have been alleged to be of such philosophical significance, in particular those conducted by Benjamin Libet, don't seem to me or to many other philosophers to really show what they're intended to show. They're supposed to show that our conscious decisions are not up to us because they're the products of unconscious decisions, if that phrase makes sense, that are made by the brain or in the brain before we're even aware of them and before we've made conscious decisions. There are a lot of philosophical assumptions there that need to be scrutinized, and I don't think they bear scrutiny. There are scientifically relevant discoveries that do need to be taken into account. So, I alluded at the beginning to the fact that at some point our scientific worldview was rather deterministic. In light of quantum mechanics and the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, that has sort of fallen by the wayside to some extent, at least. I mean, now it's somewhat commonly assumed that determinism is false. And so then the question becomes, okay, what implications does that have for free will? And I didn't mention this at all yet, but there are those who'd argue, and compatibilists throughout history have argued, that actually that's bad news for free will. You need determinism to be true in order to have free will, because otherwise our actions, if they are at these indeterministic nodes, are just random. They're just, no more than like a roll of a die, which is not something that's up to us. So that has to be taken into account. In terms of whether Jewish thinkers have done so, not very much. I mentioned before Professor David Schatz. He has another wonderful paper called Is Matter All That Matters? With some subtitle that I don't remember right now, but it starts as Matter All That Matters, and it takes up this issue at great length and in great detail. He talks, among other things, about the neuroscientific revolution, genetic revolution, and other scientific facts, but also philosophical arguments that bear on this question.
Interesting. And I suppose my very, very last question, and feel free to not answer it, and then we can just cut this from the end of the podcast, which is, at the moment, where you stand on this ever shifting field, because it's as I say, it's a field that on the one hand has many hundreds of years worth of serious intellectual arguments, stretching back for at least 1,000 years. On the other hand, it's a field that's constantly updating itself, both on the philosophical side, the scientific side, more avenues being explored, more discoveries being made in the lab. So where would you say your sympathies, broadly speaking, currently lie on this spectrum, just out of sheer curiosity?
My sympathies lie with those who are skeptical of our having free will. So I wouldn't say I'm fully confident that we don't have free will, but I think that there are so many difficulties and problems and mysteries that I don't see any solution to, that I tend to think that we don't have free will. Which is why, for me, Kreskas is something of a hero. So in the Hasidic thinkers, you have this, but you don't have any sort of full-on grappling with the consequences. Whereas in Kreskas, we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but I think he really develops an entire philosophical worldview that's meant to accommodate this lack of freedom and still make sense of our having a Torah, the importance of there being a Torah that God commands, the importance of being in this world. And so, I think it's definitely worth studying and worth taking a look, because if you have religious tendencies, but also think that we don't have free will, you are left with this real challenge. What's the point of it all?
Right. We discussed a little bit. You mentioned the incentive structure.
Yeah, that's a sideshow. There's much more interesting stuff. Maimonides' question, which Kreskas is addressing, is, what's the point of issuing the mitzvot? And Kreskas's answer is just simple and obvious, right? Which is that the mitzvot are still causally efficacious, right? So if, it's our belief that we have this mitzvah that actually plays a role in our doing this, doing the mitzvot and, observing the commandments. That doesn't address the bigger question, which Maimonides does not raise, which is, well, what's the point of all of it together? What's the point of the commandments and the observance taken together? And that's not something Maimonides asks, but it is something I think that Kreskas manages to address. But I guess that's for another podcast.
For another time, yes. Well, Professor Aaron Segal, I'm very, very grateful for you coming on our podcast. Whether you had a choice to do so or not is obviously an open question. But nonetheless, we are extremely grateful for your participation. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. And we look forward to your future writings and research in this field and seeing what comes of it. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.